a cold and dark night, the wind howled through the barren trees, making eerie whispering sounds. In a small abandoned village, there stood an old, crumbling house known among the locals for its terrifying legends. It was said that a family had once lived there, only to vanish under mysterious circumstances, leaving no trace behind. Since then, the house had been called the Void Manor. Jason, a 25-year-old adventurous young man, decided to prove to everyone that the tales were nothing but myths. With a passion for exploring abandoned places and a hobby of collecting stories about spirits and mysterious entities, he planned his next adventure. One night, armed with his camera, he decided to visit the Void Manor to document everything. Accompanying him was his girlfriend, Emma, who hesitated but couldn't let him go alone. When they arrived at the house, the entrance was half open, as if inviting them in. The air was thick with tension, as though the atmosphere itself was alive, watching. The walls were cracked, and the wooden floor groaned with every step. Jason turned on his flashlight and began recording, saying, "Welcome to the Void Manor. Tonight we'll uncover the truth behind the legends." As they explored the first floor, they found strange drawings on the walls, some resembling ritualistic symbols. Many doors were tightly shut, despite the house being abandoned for decades. In the old living room, they noticed a rocking chair swaying gently. As Jason approached, it stopped abruptly. "Did you see that?" Emma asked, clutching Jason's arm tightly. "Just the wind. Don't worry," Jason replied, trying to sound calm, though his voice betrayed his unease. As they climbed to the second floor, strange noises began to emerge. Soft footsteps, incomprehensible whispers, and occasionally faint laughter echoed in the darkness. Jason tried to reassure Emma, but he couldn't ignore the creeping fear growing inside him. In one of the rooms, they found a small wooden chest in the corner. When Jason opened it, he discovered an old diary. The pages were filled with erratic handwriting describing bizarre events that happened to the family who had lived there. The final page bore a single sentence written in blood: "You will not leave." "Jason, we need to go now," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Not yet. We're so close to the truth," Jason replied with determination. But the truth was not what they had expected. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging them into complete darkness. They heard a sound coming from downstairs, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. When Jason pointed his flashlight, they saw shadows moving along the hallway. "Who's there?" Jason shouted, but there was no response. The shadows began to gather at the end of the corridor, forming a distorted human figure. The entity moved slowly toward them, with the ground trembling under its steps. Its eyes were voids of complete darkness, like gateways to another dimension. "Run, Emma!" Jason screamed, pulling her toward the stairs. When they reached the entrance, they found it tightly shut, though it had been open when they entered. The sounds behind them grew louder, and the entity was close enough that they could smell its pungent, decayed stench. In a desperate act, Jason decided to confront the entity. He grabbed his camera and directed the bright light at it, but the entity was unaffected. Instead, it laughed, a horrifying sound that made Emma cry. "It knows our names!" Emma gasped in horror as the entity whispered, "Jason, Emma, you are mine now." In the final moments, Emma remembered the symbols she had seen on the walls. "Jason, the symbols! Maybe they're the key to escaping!" she screamed, pointing to the carvings near the entrance. Jason and Emma quickly drew the symbols in the same sequence on the floor using chalk they had found in one of the drawers. As the final symbol was completed, the house shook violently, and the shadows began to dissipate. The door swung open, and a rush of cold air filled the space. They fled the house, panting from sheer terror and exhaustion. When they reached their car, neither of them spoke a word. The engine roared to life, and they sped away from the Void Manor. But as they drove off, Jason glanced at the still recording camera. The screen showed the entity's face once more, smiling malevolently and whispering, "It's not over yet." Back in their apartment, Jason and Emma tried to piece their lives back together, but the terror of that night lingered. Jason sat at his computer, reviewing the footage from the house, hoping to find some explanation for what had happened. The more he watched, the clearer the horror became. Unheard during the recording, strange sounds emerged from the footage, voices and whispers in an unknown language. Shadows that hadn't been noticeable earlier now moved in the corners of every frame, as if something had been watching them all along. At one point, the video froze on the entity's face again. This time, it seemed to be looking directly at Jason, aware it was being observed. "Jason, what's wrong?" Emma asked, standing behind him. It's the entity. It's in the recording. It's like it knew we'd be watching." As they stared at the screen, the lights in the apartment flickered erratically. A low, menacing whisper filled the room, not from the footage, but from their surroundings. It was the same unearthly language they had heard in the house, carrying an undeniable threat. "We have to leave this place now," Emma cried. But before they could move, the lights went out completely. The room was swallowed in darkness. Heavy footsteps echoed as if someone or something was moving nearby. Suddenly, the lights returned, revealing footprints leading from the front door to where Jason and Emma stood. "It's here!" Emma screamed, backing against the wall. Jason grabbed his camera and tried to record, but the device malfunctioned. The screen displayed a single ominous message: "You cannot escape." A faint but chilling laugh filled the room, and the entity materialized in the corner, closer than ever. Jason stepped forward in defiance, but froze as the entity raised its hand and pointed directly at him, forcing him back. "What do you want from us?" Jason shouted. The entity didn't respond. Instead, it gestured toward the camera on the table. When Jason picked it up, the footage began to play on its own. The screen showed Jason and Emma in the house, but from impossible angles. The house itself seemed to have been watching them. "It wants us to return," Emma whispered, trembling. "We can't go back." "That's insane," Jason replied, though deep down he knew the entity wouldn't leave them alone. That night, sleep eluded them. Every small sound, a creaking floorboard, a gust of wind, felt like a harbinger of doom. At precisely 3 a.m., Jason awoke to a soft tapping on the window. When he looked, no one was there. But written in the condensation on the glass were the words, "Return before it's too late." "Emma, we have no choice. We have to go back and finish this," Jason said with grim resolve. "If that's the only way, then let's do it. But we need to be prepared," Emma replied, fear and determination mixing in her voice. They gathered what they could: flashlights, protective symbols they had read about online, and rudimentary weapons. With trepidation, they returned to the Void Manor, the place where their nightmare had begun. As they approached, the house loomed more foreboding than ever. The doors and windows were sealed shut, but as they drew near, the iron gate creaked open on its own, beckoning them inside. "This is the final trap," Emma muttered, hesitating to step forward. "We need to uncover the truth." "Let's end this now," Jason said firmly. Inside, the walls were adorned with new, more complex symbols. The sounds were louder and more direct, as if the entity was speaking to them. When they reached the room where they had found the diary, they discovered a new book on the table. Its pages were blank, but began filling with text as they watched. "You are part of the story now. There is no escape." "It's writing about us," Emma said, her voice trembling. At that moment, the shadows reappeared, denser and more aggressive than before. They closed in quickly, forcing Jason and Emma into a corner. The entity emerged, holding something in its hand, a small blood-smeared mirror. "Look," the entity commanded in a deep, resonant voice. When Jason and Emma gazed into the mirror, they saw distorted, hateful versions of themselves. The reflections began speaking, recounting their fears and past mistakes. "This is your fear. This is your truth," the entity said. But Jason refused to give in. "No, this isn't real. You're a parasite, feeding on fear. You won't break us," he shouted. He raised the camera and shone its bright light on the entity. The shadows began to retreat, though the entity remained. "This isn't over, humans. I am everywhere. I am within you," it declared before vanishing. Jason and Emma fled the house for the last time, knowing they had survived something beyond comprehension. But deep down, they understood the nightmare wasn't truly over. The entity was still out there, watching, waiting for another chance.